G'day, Ben from Duck Plain Chicken here. I'm currently in between builds and I'm not going to be able to get to the modelling bench for about a month, so I thought rather than sort of start a new build and stop, pause halfway through, I thought I'd do a couple of videos around tools that I use. And one of the things that, for me, when I first got into the hobby, one of the things that I was kind of interested in was the best way for mixing paints. And of course, if you're doing airbrushing, you tend to use a lot of different colors, you use lots of different brands of paints and that sort of thing. So I wanted to share with you my experiences with looking at 3 different kind of products, I guess, for automating the process of mixing paints, because shaking the little bottles, yep, sure, you can do it by hand, but better living through technology and all of that. So what I've got here is 3 contraptions that I'm going to show you that make my life easier as far as mixing paints. But I also want to talk about which one I think is best, and you can sort of decide which one would suit you better, because they all have their strengths and weaknesses. So the first one I've got here is the Hobby Mio. And I've got one of these, this is Interlab, but they're basically a vortex mixer. They're normally used for test tubes, mixing contents of test tubes. And then finally I've got my homemade jobby, which is basically a jigsaw with a clamp in it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clear the bench, and then I'm going to sort of go through these one at a time and talk about the benefits, the pros and the cons of each. Before I start with the first contraption, I want to talk about the different types of bottles that I use as far as painting goes. So you get a bit of an idea of the types of paints you can use with these mixing devices. So I use SMS paints, and this is probably the paint that I use the most. I find these lacquer paints really good to use. So theirs come in 2 sizes. You have their normal sort of paint size, and then there's a larger bottle for their primers. I also use a lot of Vallejo products which come in these dropper bottles, so these are similar to the AK interactive range. They also do bottles in this sort of format. Yeah, these are great little bottles, great little drop bottles, nice and easy for getting paint into your airbrush and working out ratios for mixing and that sort of thing. And then the final type I use, which is, covers sort of the Tamiya paints, these little glass jars, but also if you're using Mr. Hobby paints. So these are just sort of glass bottles. So at least you get an idea of, the types of bottles that I'm mixing in paint. Now, the first contraption I want to talk about is the cheapest. So I'm going to start off with the pros. This is definitely the cheapest, and it was the cheapest out of the 3 for me. It might be different depending on where you are, but for me this was the cheapest. So what this is a jigsaw, normally used for cutting timber. And in it I've got instead of a blade, which would normally come out here, so the blade would go back and forth very quickly, I have got a quick release clamp. Now I'm going to just provide a warning to start off with. This is certainly the most dangerous out of the 3. So if you're going to go down this path, just be very careful with it. It can get pretty exciting. So just to give you an idea what it actually does. And this is a jigsaw with a variable speed. So as I can sort of do the trigger a little bit, and it's also very noisy, as you've probably noticed. So anyway, when I set this rig up, and I certainly wasn't the one who came up with this idea, this was another YouTuber I saw who did this, and I know a lot of people have sort of gone down this path. But when I did this was primarily when I was using the Vallejo paints. So what I did was, in the top stop here of this quick release clamp, I drilled a bit of a hole in there, and what that does is that holds the top of the cap here. So I can clamp that in place, And then normally I can hold it sort of down, or I can hold it up, depending. And it works really well. It mixes the paint in these particular bottles really well, and it helps if you've got a ball bearing in the bottle as well. If you're going down the path of putting a ball bearing like a mixing ball in your bottles, make sure they're marine grade stainless steel. You don't want cheap ball bearings sort of rusting or reacting with the paint anyway, so make sure they're marine grade. A lot of my Vallejo bottles, especially the paints that don't really separate quite a bit, like this is supposed to be gold, you can see how much this is kind of separated. I'll put mixing balls in there just to help it. The one thing to be aware of is that the bottle can go flying out sometimes. For these bottles it's not too bad. You could put rubber bands around this or whatever, but what I find happens is eventually it'll work loose and it'll work to the side of the clamp, and then it'll just sort of slip out. So you've just got to be, you've got to be careful when you're using this particular contraption. So I use this for quite some time, and to give you an idea on price, this cost me probably a total of $45. The jigsaw was just a cheap and nasty, it's a Zito brand jigsaw. You need to make sure that when you're looking at jigsaws to go down this path that you've got a setup that you can take the blade out and put in a quick release clamp. Some have proprietary sort of settings for putting in blades and all that sort of stuff. So this was one I found that was nice and cheap, but it also had a traditional way of clamping blades in here with the, you can see 2 Allen keys go in here to loosen it up. So you need to be a bit careful of the jigsaw that you buy, and so I think the jigsaw cost me sort of maybe $20-30, and then the clamps cost me $15, but this is sort of the cheapest method. So the pros are it's cheap and it works really well with these sort of Vallejo style bottles. The problem with it is that it doesn't handle these bottles particularly well. So if I clamp one of these in, now you can see that's holding in reasonably well, but I have found that when you really put your foot into it and give it a good shake, it can work loose and it will pop out. And of course, these things being glass, the glass jars won't break, but unless you drop them on a hard surface like concrete or something. But these things, if they go flying across the room, they can do some damage. The other thing is they're not really good for doing these SMS bottles. So again, it's when you're giving them a good shake, and you can see these big ones, the jigsaw doesn't like it at all. So I have to. So there are sort of limits as far as how far you can push this contraption. And certainly if you're doing sort of really, a lot bigger bottles, like for example, like if you're trying to shake bottles like the Ultimate Modeling Products Primer or AK's One Shot Primer or whatever, this won't actually fit in this system. So that's kind of another con as well. So anyway, that's my homemade job. It has served me well, but just to give you a bit of a spoiler alert, this is no longer the one I use. Okay, the next contraption I want to show you is this vortex mixer, and these are designed specifically for mixing test tubes. They're not actually purposefully built for mixing model paint, but they can work depending on the bottles that you've got. So I'm going to start with these Vallejo style bottles, and the way they're supposed to work is you put the nose in first and you push down and it will just vibrate. And so what's happening inside the bottle is the paint sort of spinning around, and that's supposed to help to mix it up. Now I can do it the other way as well. And you can see this being gold, it is not actually mixing that bottle particularly well. I might try a different colour. Let's try this one, this is a white. it is maybe a bit hard to see, but it has completely separated. So let's see if we can get that mixed up. Now I've had this for probably 12 months now. I bought it cheap on AliExpress and I paid about $67 Australian. And I should say all prices Australian. I'm sorry, I'm not sure what that is in freedom since the Australian dollar's worth next to nothing at the moment. So you'd have to use some sort of converter to get an idea of that. Now it's maybe a little bit hard to see, but it has worked to a degree. So it's certainly far from perfect, and where it becomes kind of problematic is these Tamiya bottles. Like, it just will not mix the paint really well in there. So my experience is that these do not work well in these vortex ones, and nor do SMS paints. So I've picked out some colors that have sort of completely separated out, so you can sort of see there's, you know, multiple different colors in there. If I try and mix this one up, let's see if we can. So I'm using both ends of the bottles, and you can sort of see that it's still not mixing it properly. And sometimes I find because lacquer paints, these ones separate out quite quickly, I find where they're really quite bad, you know, separated right out into different constituents, it takes forever for it to mix on these ones. So out of the three contraptions, I would say this one's definitely the weakest. You might have different experiences depending on the paints you're using and that sort of thing. For me personally, I kind of regret buying this because it just doesn't, you know, it sounds good on paper. You can just press the bottle in and it'll mix. But for me, I'm kind of sorry I bought this just because it hasn't worked for me. I've tried it lots and lots. And for a while I was sort of using it exclusively, but I just found I had to hold the bottle on forever in order for it to mix. So that's the vortex one, and I've kind of saved the best for last. So I got this about 4 or 5 months ago, and it is now my go-to for mixing paints. I wasn't expecting a lot out of this thing. I thought, you know, it didn't really look that flash, but it actually works really well because it works for multiple bottles. I find it mixes the colors really well. And the way this works is you strap the bottle to this little V-shaped receptacle here, strap it in, and then it actually sort of shakes or rotates the bottle around. This thing cost me $100, so it's the most expensive out of the three. The reason it costs so much is not just because I bought this, but I also bought a clamp to clamp it to the bench, because this thing likes to jump around quite a bit. So I definitely recommend getting the clamp with it as well. You get a number of these sort of rubberized straps. I think you get 4 of them. What I can do is show you this one. So this is a really bad sort of separation of colours. Let's strap this one in and see how the Hobby Mio copes with it. And so you can see we've still got a little bit in there, but it's definitely a lot better than what it was. So the good thing about this is you can sort of, once it's clamped to the desk, you can throw a bottle of paint in and just leave it. It'll just keep, you know, shaking it up. And let's see how we go with this one. I think the fact that it's not actually clamped to the desk is not helping either. Alright, again, probably needs just a little bit longer, but you can see that it is definitely starting to mix that paint really well. And I've found with this, certainly with the SMS paints as they separate, I can just leave it in this thing and it'll eventually sort it out. The other thing is, of course, this doesn't really have a limit as far as the types of bottles it can handle. So it can handle the Tamiya bottles just fine. Like I showed before, it can certainly handle these style of dropper bottles, but it can also handle bigger bottles as well. So like, you know, one-shot primer, that sort of thing. It'll go a little bit slower, but it'll still be able to mix it. So for me, this is definitely the winner. It is more expensive, but I've just found sort of in the last few months that I've had it, I've found it's great. So normally, especially when using lots of colors, I will you know, spray on a color and then rinse out my airbrush, but while I'm rinsing out the airbrush, I'll have the next color mixing in this. So it just works really well. It is like a metal body, it's a aluminium sort of body. It seems really well made. It does come with sort of a rubberized thing for the bottom to kind of reduce the vibration, but for me, you definitely want to get the clamp and clamp it to the side of your desk. So that's it, just a little bit of information about mixing paints and the sort of contraptions out there that you can get. For me, this one's a winner, but also the handmade one, if you haven't got a lot of money, you know, that might be the path you want to go down. It is a little bit more exciting too to mix paints that way. So until next video, I'll catch you later.